Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, idiot, and loin streamer, and today we're going to be covering a new article from The Atlantic called Has DEI Backlash Come for Publishing? This was published on June 19th of 2024, and we're going to get there soon. Get your thoughts on what's been going on. This is by Dan Sinkin and Richard Jean So. Before we get started, number one, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Number two, if you would like to be featured on the channel, check out the links down in the description below. The number one way to be featured is through Lemwy, the monthly prompt writing contest, where I give you a prompt, you write a short story using that prompt, and on the first Monday video of the month, we bask in your creativity. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author and you have a book out or a book that is coming out. If you submit it to the Fresh Meat feature, the first chapter will be read here on the channel to hopefully help more readers find your work, because that is what I hope to do, and I can't get to every book. So hopefully that's one way to find more people or to spread the good news of your work. The third thing is, if you would like to check out any of my books, they are available at any of your favorite places to get books, including the local library upon request. My next book, newest book, comes out in October, called Bodymore Zero. So look forward to that. The ARC copies will be coming out soon, like next month-ish, maybe August. And yeah, with that said, let's jump into the topic. Has the DEI backlash come for publishing? A new study reveals positive changes since 2020, but can they last? So obviously, there's a lot of discussion in general about diversity focusing. If you go to different channels like Cindy Reed's, and she's had a couple of videos where she's talked about people pretending to be different races in order to get published. More recently, she had another one where somebody changed their name to Kimchi to try to get published after what looked like 14 years of not being published. And so there have obviously been changes. Obviously, I've even covered on this channel a couple of times where people have said, hey, white men are being discriminated against, white people are being discriminated against, and then you have the backlash of, hey, well, you were all in control for this amount of time, and a lot of just like throwing opportunism, and in my opinion, it's a lot of throwing opportunism and identity at each other to try to get a stranglehold where they didn't have one before. But it's just ridiculous to me if that's not what publishing is. But if it is what the traditional publishing industry has been for hundreds of years, we got a problem in general. But so let's talk about what The Atlantic has found. In July of 2020, Lisa Lucas was hired at the publisher of Pantheon and Schocken Books, prestigious imprints of Penguin Random House. She was the first person of color to hold the post. Black Lives Matter was resurgent after the murder of George Floyd. Demands for books by Black authors had spiked. Publishing employees had organized a day of action to protest the industry's ongoing role in systemic racism. Publishers, compelled to act, released statements, hired more diverse staff, and acquired books by writers of color. 2 years later, Lucas anchored the feature essay, The New York Times, about the changes in the industry. May Mavji, Lucas's boss, was quoted as saying, "It's extraordinary how much she's managed to achieve in such a short amount of time." But on May 20th, 2024, Lucas was let go. The move, Mavji wrote in a memo to employees, was necessary for our future growth. At the same time, Kopp publisher Regan Author was also laid off. So one thing that I want to bring up, and we're going to have some uncomfortable discussions here, but we have to ask uncomfortable questions in order to have real discussions. So please take that as you will. Don't take anything as an insult at anyone specifically or as an attack on anyone specifically. There's no way that we can actually discuss issues if stuff triggers a critical response. But so if something like an event like George Floyd were to trigger, hey, a demand for something, does that mean that it is an authentic growth of something, or is it the same as any other trend? Like, oh, this book caused a call for a bunch of books about vampires because it was super popular and now everyone wants to read about vampires. If the news pushes a tragedy and then everybody wants to read about that tragedy, and so then a bunch of people start jumping on the trend of talking about the tragedy, whether it's war, whether it's a presidential election that upset everybody, whether it is an opioid crisis, whether it is mental health failing, whether it is generative AI and a bunch of people doing generative AI books, does that mean that it is an organic growth and interest in something, or does that mean that there is a spike of interest as normal trends do, where it's a bunch of people saying they want something and then tapering off? Because if something like that is a response to a current situation, such as it's saying, well, George Floyd happened, so there was a demand spike. That tells me that it is cause and effect, not a natural call for something specific. Let alone, I remember that summer when I was on Twitter and I was seeing so many agents and so many publishers specifically saying that they were only accepting books by Black authors, and then they wanted books that were specifically about Black experience. And I remember that I have questions about the ethicalness of what was happening at that time, not specifically by the discrimination, which we know is illegal in the United States, but that doesn't really matter. We can go over that 1.5 million times and it didn't stop anybody from not doing it. But one of the books that we read on the Loin stream was The Library of the Dead, and that was by an author that was from Zimbabwe, and the book was moved to Scotland, but nothing in the book actually felt Scottish. And so part of me wondered if he was one of those authors that was plucked up because of this push in the publishing industry, and then they took his book that may have been actually set in Zimbabwe, because his other books are set in Zimbabwe. We'll never know what changed in the editing floor, but who knows if that book was picked up and published at that time, but was changed, but the location was requested or forced to change in order to be more palatable to a white audience. Because we've seen that happen in books before. We've seen that happen with covers before. We've seen it happen with characters before. So why wouldn't it? And we've seen it happen with settings before. So in a situation where stuff just doesn't match and it doesn't seem like there's a heavy understanding of the culture behind why something was chosen, it makes sense to question, was this just done to jump on a marketing trend at the time and to try to maximize sales in something that is familiar, which is trying to cross into the white purchasers by doing this? I don't know. And it could have been that way because and it could have been just the author is not good at setting because that author lives in Scotland or has lived in Scotland. So we'll never know, but I wonder. But the question still remains that if a trend in publishing happens in response to something happening in real life, does that mean that there is a long-term demand for it, or is it just a momentary demand? In the same way, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, there was an uptick in books that were talking about Donald Trump, that were vilifying Donald Trump, that were making Donald Trump into the villain of a fictional series. And would it make sense to call that a natural demand for it, or would it be an emotional demand for it? Because if you're talking about a highly emotional event that was a police death, no matter how you feel about it one way or another, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but if that was in response to an emotional call of the time, then doesn't it make sense that after the emotions of that have gone down and are no longer swelling, that so too would the trend? Because it was not a natural interest, it was a trauma related interest. Does that make sense? To many in publishing, Lucas's rise and fall has become the most revealing example of how quickly efforts at diversity in publishing can be rolled back in the name of economic realities. The TV writer and novelist Kashna Kohli responded on Blue Sky to Lucas's ouster that it was like watching a serial killer work. The George Floyd era is over, and it's amazing how many people don't want us around. Lucas herself posted on X, the only hard part is what it meant to Black writers. So I have to pause there again. If you're trying to emotionally manipulate people to hold on to a position at a business, or else they hate you, and this is some bigger thing, that's usually not what it is. I'm not going to say that there is no abuse in any business or any industry, because there clearly is a history. There clearly are histories of these, and people are people, and people going to do what people do. But if it says that they were rolled back for economic realities, then that means that whatever the corporation, at least the way that I interpret it, and take it as you will, because I'm not an economist, so feel free. This is why we are group getting information on this. But if they say that they had to lay off that person for economic realities, then that tells me that the choices that they were making at the time were not economically feasible to keep doing because they weren't making back their investment. And so in order to keep the business alive, they would have to follow the trends of the market, which is what the market were doing. Now, in a lot of cases, in a lot of businesses are mostly opportunistic. Is they're going to do what they see there's money in. And so if they take you on in a position where there's an emotional response calling for a certain thing, then you're only going to be in that position so long as it makes the money. If you're not good at your job, or if you're not doing the performance that they want you to do, and then they'll let you go. And it's not some bigger message, it's just corporations doing what corporations do. And I say this having worked normal jobs before, where they work you to the bone and then they let you go if you don't just roll over and do what they want you to do, one way or another. And that's just the way that corporations are. So I don't really like or understand the point of trying to make business as usual into some bigger message, other than it being some manipulative attempt, because it doesn't matter that she was let go specifically for racial reasons when they say it's for economic reasons, unless you're trying to say, well, because this person wasn't kept on and it wasn't economically feasible because people don't actually care about this racial group in general. And the only way to prove that you care about a racial group is to artificially put somebody in a position that will then be a message to everybody else. Look, one person's success does not mean success for everybody. Just like one person's failure or one person's crime doesn't mean it's a failure or a crime for everybody else. So I don't really understand this, because it's just business. And that's what's really confusing in any of the conversations, is when an individual's actions are taken to be some bigger meaning thing when it's not. Like, we live this every day. Anyway, I'm repeating myself. Let me know what you think. The gains in diversity in recent years were real and unprecedented. One of us, Richard, published a study in 2020, Just How White is the Book Industry, showing how many more white authors of fiction than authors of color have been given opportunities by major publishers since 1950. The study looks at the adult fiction, excluding children's fiction and young adult novels. That's interesting. I would actually distrust that, because from the stats that I saw on Twitter, the YA and children's literature have so much diversity in them specifically. And so when you do things like this, you're not taking into account where people are applying for publication. And if more people are just applying for YA and then getting into YA instead of writing adult novels, that's going to look in the numbers. So you're technically cooking the numbers by omission, by pretending that there are not other genres and other age categories in which people are applying to. And it's very dishonest. In some of those YA categories, it was like over 50% were non-white authors, according to the survey that was shared on Twitter. The final year of the study, 2018, was one of the best for authors of color, who wrote 11% of the books published that year. We have now replicated this survey in 2019 through 2023, looking at fiction published by Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Simon Schuster, and Macmillan. 4 of the big 5, Hatchet, was excluded from the previous study, so we excluded it here too. To identify the racial identities of the authors of these novels, we worked alongside 4 research assistants, reading through biographies, interviews, and social media posts. Each author was reviewed independently by 2 researchers. We also split off Black writers from all other writers, Indigenous, Asian, Latino, mixed, interracial, or biracial. So here we have authorship of publishing conglomerates by race 2019 to 2013, and 88% in 2019 for white, 4% for Black, and 8% for all other races. Why do they all get lumped in one? And then this just goes all the way up to 75% for white in 2023, 9% for Black, and 16% for all other races. And again, this excludes any publication that's happening in YA or children's literature, which I think is insanely dishonest, because you have to look at you have to look at where the efforts are going for the people applying. And YA is where a lot of money is. YA is where the majority of money is right now. After examining a total of 1,730 novels written by 1,158 unique authors, we found that non-white writers of fiction more than doubled their share of published work in the last 5 years. Work by white authors dropped from 88 to 75%. This proportionality still falls short of reflecting the general population. But who says that stuff has to reflect the general population? You're also assuming that the general population has just as many authors throughout, or writers, or people interested in the arts in that way, in every demographic to match the proportion of the demographic. That is also a falsehood. We have no idea what the proportionality of artists among different racial groups is, but to assume that you need to have a matching amount to proportional to your readership, or to your state population, to your country population, is asinine. But again, you can't even do this unless you look at what's being published in YA and children's literature. Although these findings point to significant gains, they also demand that we reckon with what appears to be the beginning of their reversal, to contemplate what can be done to avoid a seemingly inevitable cycle of retrenchment following any progress. One, what about this says anything about regression, because it's continuing to go forward in one way? Two, what I said before, if this was inspired from a specific thing happening at the time, then does it count as a grassroots thing, or does it follow as trend chasing, that once that fever pitch starts coming down, then you're going to start losing steam and people are going to start losing interest in something? And that's one of the dangers of constantly trend following, because what was popular a year or two ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, people are not going to be caring about as much, and so it's not going to have as much pull. And you can't really consider that to be an organic change in the people, because it was spiked on by an emotional response. Did people really get more interested in politics in 2016, or was it an emotional response to the way that Donald Trump and that election was covered? Because has interest not dropped in political content in the last couple of years? You let me know. Publishing has long been a white business. In 1950, Zora Neale Hurston, What White Publishers Won't Print, about the limited range of representation allowed for Black writers and their characters. After a small effort at diversification in the late 60s and early 70s following the civil rights movement, the status quo was restored. In 1981, Mel Watkin wrote in the New York Times that not only are publishers not taking Black writers on their own terms, increasingly, they are no longer taking them at all. Publishers Weekly asked in 1994, will an overwhelmingly white publishing industry remain a metaphorical house without doors, attracting neither minority workers to their employ nor minority audiences to their product? The following year, the author and editor of James Ledbetter wrote The Unbearable Whiteness of Publishing for the Village Voice. Notwithstanding a very gradual expansion of non-white writers on publishing lists, little altered the status quo from 1995 to 2020. So, something that then stands out to me because of this is that the same words have been said again and 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 again for like 50 years. And so are you going to tell me that literally nothing has changed? All of the progress that has been touted about in everything has equated to zero change in the last 50 years. Now, I understand that things also can change slowly, but this wants you to believe that they are saying the exact same things 50 years ago as now, when there have been historical changes and relationship changes throughout the United States, where the makeup of the country has changed. And if it hasn't changed in the publishing industry, who is to blame? Because it's not the regular Americans that have nothing to do with choosing what gets published and what doesn't get published. We're all on the same playing field of being rejected. Publishing is a very competitive field, and they're going to pick generally what they think is going to sell. Is that not true? Is that it's not a business, it's a pet project, that they only pick the things that they personally approve of, not the things that they think will sell? That's often one thing that I think people forget, because yeah, writing is an art, but it's also a product. And so they're often, generally, my understanding is that the company is going to pick what they think is going to sell, and maybe they'll take a chance on something new. Often they won't, though. I thought we noticed this more and more with the TikTok stuff, where stuff explodes on TikTok and then publishers like gobble it up because they're like, oh, you've already got 1 million followers. Or the same thing with fan fiction, where they're like, oh, you've already got 1 million readers. Come over here, we can sell this. Before the summer of 2020, literary agents described difficulty placing work by non-white writers. Editors would off-stock phrases such as, I wouldn't really know how to break this out widely, which the agent Semeya Bendemired Robert told us spoke to discomfort or a lack of institutional knowledge about how to publish authors of color. Industry consensus recognized white women from the age of 30 to 60 as publishing's primary market, which offered an alibi, often tacit, coded in professional publium, for rejecting work by non-white writers. When Roberts successfully sold books by authors of color, she refocused an editorial strength and crucially deployed comparative titles and comps by successful white writers. Would that not be the norm because they were the majority of the market, for one, but also for two, that also speaks on the issues of the agents, not of anybody else? It takes me back to the article that was talking about a new face for Westerns, where the agents were the ones turning down these books saying, oh no, regular Americans wouldn't be interested in your immigrant perspective. And it's like, you're the one saying that. You're the one talking for people. You're not hearing from these other people that said they want something different. So, like, you can't really be the agent. I mean, you can, but it speaks for a smarminess of an agent who is gatekeeping and then blaming other people who are not involved in this decision and not involved in looking at what's selling in the market. And if you can freaking pick up a book like Fourth Wing that is completely trash, garbage, boo trash, and get it out there, put your money dollars behind something that's got other things. Not to mention, is Fourth Wing not like a completely just mixed cast of races and sexes, so it doesn't even matter? So, like, what is the excuse here? What I've basically noticed as a layman, so feel free to, backhand me figuratively, is that if you put money behind something, it gets out to people and it's gonna go. Even a lot of the time when it's garbage trash, garbage boo-boo trash. So what is the excuse here? And the agents that blame other people are the problem. Comps are powerful in publishing. Publishers use them to better gauge the value of a prospective acquisition. Which titles from the past few years does it most resemble? Agents choose comps carefully because of the weight that they are given making a deal. The ubiquity of comps by white authors sustains white dominance and compels non-white writers to either play with market ethic expectations or match a white standard. One study showed that from 2013 to 2019, more than 95% of 500 most used comps were white authors. The paucity of non-white comps means that there are far fewer paths by which a non-white writer can present a convincing case to an acquiring editor. I think that this is making an issue out of race that is not actually there, because when you're doing comp titles, and again, this is just my perspective, feel free to share what you think on this, but when you're using comp titles and you want to pick famous titles, big titles that people know about, not like random titles that other people are not going to know. So in general, you're going to reach for titles that you think that the acquisition agent or the audience are going to be familiar with. It's much more likely that if you say Stephen King, people will recognize it than if you even say Paul Tremblay or Roxane Gay or Matt Shaw or a bunch of like much smaller things. It also, in general, it also makes more sense if you're reaching for what is the top of the lists, the famous titles. That's really what you're going to go for. And you can go for stuff in other countries, but then you have to think, how popular are those books from other countries in our country? Because you're looking for recognition. You're trying to show that it can sell in the current market. That's at least my understanding. And I don't think it's a racial issue. You're not saying you can't get through unless you do white things, because what the frick does Gretchen's book have in common with Stephen King's? It doesn't. But they went for the title that had the most recognition, the most accolades, instead of mentioning stuff like Body Snatcher or Stepford Wives or something else that had more comparable elements to it. And it's not a racial issue. It's just what is selling. And this also doesn't take into account the racial makeup of the country that they're talking about from previous. So you're likely going to have more best-selling books by white authors in previous years because of the genetic makeup, the racial makeup of the country. So there are multiple issues going on, but I think boiling it down to this is just going to create anger and resentment that doesn't need to be there. And then it's just going to make a victim out of everybody and anger at everybody. And I don't know what the publishing industry thinks it's doing. And I don't know what these other publications like The Atlantic think they're doing, when it's just trying to push anger and rage and some sort of you owe me and back out of the way because you owe me, instead of letting us as authors, as creators, work with our unique dispositions and our unique expressions. And we're not competition with one another because we're not writing the same thing. But this wants to act like there are only so many seats at the table, and that because you wear the same facial skin color, that because you wear the same color as somebody else, that means that you've benefited from it when you don't. Amber Oliver, who worked as an editor at Harper, thought at first that she had a difficulty acquiring books by writers of color because she was an inexperienced assistant editor. But she told us, after having been there over the years, trying to buy books that I knew were good and that I knew had a solid readership that I had the comps for, and I was still getting pushback. I was still getting pushback. Her colleagues would say, I just don't see it. And there's already a book out there like this, reasoning that felt to Oliver like a racial double standard. How many books in the industry by white men are about the same thing that they continue to publish with no issue? Why can't that be the same for everyone? In a PEN America report on diversity in publishing, Jenny Hugh, an editor at Atria Books, called the one is enough rule, described in the article as the belief that books by authors of similar backgrounds that follow a similar theme or format are simply different versions of the same story, and that audiences are hungry for only one of such one story at a time. This is actually not only an issue given to non-white authors, it's also given to white authors, and it's also, oh, we already have one of these, so you can go somewhere else. It's also given to people for a personal background, for trauma. It's a common use thing. And again, I think it's assigning intent where it's just a common issue that everybody faces. But to say that it's a blanket rule in general that happens to a lot of people isn't as marketable as saying that it is a specific kind of oppression that one person gets. The question also then becomes is, because you're the acquisition agent, the question becomes, can I see a market for this? Do I see people hungry for this? And somebody might be like, oh, here's another vampire book, just like Twilight, similar to Twilight. Well, not that similar, but similar enough. Let's put it out there because people are looking for it. If there is an obvious hunger in the marketplace for something, people looking for the next Game of Thrones, people looking for the next whatever is the most popular right now, that's going to get it. People will nom it at the bits. Look at how many people have been following after ACOTAR, trying to be the next ACOTAR, mostly in the indie publishing sphere. As long as you know somebody, an acquisition agent, who can see the market for what you're selling, then they'll go for it. And there can never be enough of the same thing. But the one is enough rule does not just go for one story. And I think that's just a bias that a lot of people have in general. I've seen the same thing go, look, I've read a fantasy story by white men, one and the same, they're all the same. I actually say something similar about a lot of fantasy books where I'm like, is it a fantasy book that looks like it's inspired by D&D? Does it start in a tavern? Does it star a paladin or a bard? I mean, the people who love those tropes are going to eat it up. But me, no, they all look the same. I'm sorry to all of you bard and paladin writers. Beginning in the summer of 2020, editors started to have a much easier time placing and acquiring books by non-white writers. The biggest change was just an eagerness, Robert said, and an awareness of a market for writers of color. The comedian, actor, and writer Phoebe Robinson launched Tiny Reparations Books, dedicated to addressing the lack of diversity in publishing, in partnership with Plume, a division of Penguin Random House, in July of 2020, and hired Oliver in August of that year. They just really trusted me to do the job, said Oliver, who is now at Bloomsbury. They gave me free rein to trust my taste and go after the projects that I thought were great. At Tiny Reparations, she acquired fiction by Black authors such as Kai Harris's What the Fireflies Knew, LaToya Watkins' Parish, and Janelle M. Williams' Gone Like Yesterday. Our data shows that a broad range of imprints and editors supported the push for diversity in terms of sheer numbers. The mainstream publishing imprints, William Morrow, Riverhead Books, and Simon & Schuster, led in putting out books by Black authors alongside Black-led imprints, 37 Inc., Amistad, and Tiny Reparations. Historically, what has been especially pernicious are the limitations publishers have placed on the kinds of stories Black writers in particular are permitted to publish. This is what Zora Neale Hurston wrote about in that 1950s essay criticizing the simplistic stereotypes writers were coerced into perpetuating, which that is true because authors are often told by agents to write a certain way, write characters a certain way. This is what's more publishable. This is what's more popular. I remember there being somebody that mentioned before, if you're writing paranormal romance, then there is this expectation that if you're writing paranormal romance, then they want a sassy, not bossy, but like a sassy, strong female lead, usually with a certain kind of name. And I even remember somebody saying that when she was writing paranormal romance, she was looking into what were the most popular names in that genre because it was better to put expected names in those books because readers went into those books with very specific desires for what a paranormal romance book has. This is what a heroine is. This is what the tropes are going to be. This is what the story is going to be. And so then you kind of, even if you want to write a story that would fall into paranormal, if it doesn't fit that, then you're going to make everybody angry. And so then it locks in what you're technically allowed to do, writing the same stereotypes in this other genre. And so I use paranormal romance as an example to separate it from the racial tones of this conversation, that it's not something that only happens in one way. If you have any other genres that you can think of that kind of force stereotypes in, or you've experienced that too, please let us know in the comments down below, because I think this is something that needs to be in general discussed from the different perspectives of what we've all seen and what we've all experienced, instead of just being told this is one way. We need to exchange the ideas and the experiences we have in order to get closer to the truth of what is happening to anybody. Percival Everett satirized the enduring situation, the requirement for Black writers to write what white publishers considered to be Black books, in his 2001 novel Erasure, adapted by Cord Jefferson into the film American Fiction in 2023. Ironically, American Fiction criticized the industry in its most diverse year to date, and at the moment of change on this particular front. Did anyone see that movie? What'd y'all think? In recent decades, Black writers have largely been published in genres such as historical novels, especially the neo-slave narratives, the multi-generational saga, romance in various flavors, and satire. Let's not forget, often YA, especially YA horror, and I think YA romance and YA fantasy. Like, go and look at the covers for recently published YA books. These genres continue to thrive in the works by Britt Bennett, Essie Edgegun, Sedega Johnson, Tara M. Stringfellow, Charmaine Wilkerson, and many others. But more room is open for Black writers to work in genres such as horror, Megan Giddings, Bethany Morrow, suspense and thriller, Remy Adalek, Coney Briscoe, Wanda M. Morris, fantasy, C.L. Clark, Marlon James, and science fiction, Maurice Broaddus, Temi O. Black women have taken up racial satire and made it specific in media industries, and Black writers have taken up minor genres previously almost exclusive to white writers, such as campus novels and recovery novels and the rock and roll novel. The industry's increased appetite for racial diverse stories does not by itself solve the persistent dilemma non-white writers face. What Ismail Mohammed in the New York Times Magazine article has called the reparations trap. A lot of editorial considerations were couched in the conversation about the author's identity, Robert told us. It's a vulnerable position. Representation sells, or at least that's the idea. When the industry is overwhelmingly white, when it conceives of its audience as principally white, when whiteness is embedded in the institutional workings, overcoming what Mohammed's drawing on a famous formulation by Webb Du Bois calls the double consciousness that white supremacy imposes on the Black writer's psyche is a struggle. But the expansion of the space for non-white writers in the literary field has made it easier. There is a long way to go, Oliver said, but there are definitely more opportunities. You could now do a slice of life narrative, whereas in before times, people might say, oh, is that important enough? Why do books by people of color always have to be important? So there are a couple of things about this. Number one, again, I don't think that you can associate the yuppie culture of publishers and agents specifically with the regular person, because I don't necessarily think that agents represent the layman, that represent the regular person that goes into the bookstore to pick something off the shelf. And so then your problem here is marking everybody with this brush of what you're calling a racial politic when it's really yuppie culture. And yuppie culture is, I don't know, I will say it's different than the cultures that I know, but we're all going to have different experiences. So that's whatever it is. That's why it also gets difficult, because people want to tell you what your experiences are, assuming what your background is based on what they think of that you have because of your identity. And my guys, I don't have a dad. I haven't had a dad for 20 years. He left and the life fell apart. He chose not to be here. But so like, bro, people can't even assume my physical sex correctly. I don't expect anybody to get any of the other background information correctly. But there's that. So there are assumptions being made based on arbitrary stereotypes, often racially. without considering economic differences of these different groups. And the gatekeepers are generally of a different class. And they're the ones that are also saying, perform this way, do it this way because we think that this is going to sell. Everybody that I've heard that goes through traditional publishing can generally expect to receive changes on their manuscript based on what the publisher or the agents or the editors think are going to either be offensive or not sell well. And they might say, take this out. They might say, insert a love story, insert a third wheel in there or a love triangle in there because it's super popular, and it'll change the story. That can happen. And it happens to everybody, and it happens in different ways. And I won't say that the publisher is trying to profitize off of your identity is not a violation, because I think it's a violation. I've said for years that I think publishers, agents, all of these people needing to know what your racial identity is, your sexual identity, your sexual history, or anything that is a personal thing, your medical history, so that you can then claim this is authentic because I am this thing, and then you're selling your personal information as the thing that sells your book. That's a violation. And so any of these agents that do that to anybody for racial reasons, I think are violating what is ethical behavior, which is treating authors with just dignity of being a creator. And if you want to put yourself out on that, if you want to put yourself out there as, this is me, this is my experience, that's one thing. But if the agents or the companies try to make you do that, I think that's a rude violation. Oh, but I also have to ask about this interest in other cultures and I don't think that it's a racial thing. And I think that there is a disinterest in politics specifically being in fiction. And some people can say that they don't think that identity is political, but some people do, especially when you're talking about, well, your entire country is racist, your entire being is racist, your entire history and everything is racist. And people often don't want to get into random books and have that put in front of their face. They just want to read a book, maybe get into a character, maybe get into a fantasy. Because I wonder how these statistics would look if you're talking about, like, a lot of people have started reading manga and have started getting into anime where they weren't into anime and manga before. I remember when I was a teenager, I have always been into anime and manga, and I actually used IRC to get fan scans and fan translations of stuff. I was watching Naruto back when it was still like episode 30, 31, 32, 40, whatever were coming out in Japan fresh new. That's how on it I was. But so many people have, and I was mocked. You were a loser for reading anime or manga. You were always a weeb. I actually got bullied out of studying Japanese because I was told as a white person I shouldn't study Japanese, I should pick a white language to study because it made me a loser to study a language and a culture that did not match my skin tone. And as a teenager, I allowed that to influence me instead of doing what I wanted to do. So I would wonder what the claims are here when so many people actually do reach outside of American culture and American-made things in order to experience things made by other countries. So many video games are also made by foreign countries. So, like, how does that play into all of this assumption that it is all racially based and not about the content of the stories or about what the agents are doing? Because I don't doubt for a second that there are agents misusing their power, as taboo as that might be to say. The question now, made urgent by the dismissal of Lucas, followed a few weeks later by hatchet laying off of Tracy Sherrod, who had been another publishing very few high-profile Black women, is whether the moment will last. We have good reason to think that it won't. Two previous cycles left little change. The first, the civil rights movement's effort in the late 1960s, slowed considerably by the mid-70s, leading finally to the departure of key figures such as Mary Brown from Doubleday in 1981 and Toni Morrison from Random House in 1983. The second began in the late 90s and petered out in the mid-2000s. Initial enthusiasm led to a spat of hires and acquisitions of books by more diverse writers, but as we learned through our historical research and our discussions with people in the field, those hires received too little support and endure discrimination, and many leave if they're not ousted first. Publishers announce the acquisitions brought in by editorial with fanfare, but publishers then failed to provide adequate investments in marketing, publicity, and sales. The titles underperform and set up to fail provide publishers with an excuse to disinvest. Looking to past eras of diversification in publishing, we find that the turning point comes about every 4 years into the cycle, which is exactly where we are. So that just sounds like a typical cycle of a trend. And I know that it probably sucks. It probably hurts to hear that it is a trend to be pushing and publishing things in a certain way when it's related to your identity. But I think that's also a reality. And I think that that is honestly something that has always bothered me about the genreification of people's identities. When you start putting your race as basically a marker's genre, as you start putting your sexuality as basically a marketing genre, as you put your chronic illness, your mental illness, your physical illness, your disability as these marketing tabs in order to sell a book to a specific genre because mental illness is popular right now, because chronic illness is popular right now, because disabilities is popular right now. If you treat it just like a genre instead of just telling a story, then at some point that trend is going to end in its popularity and you're going to get into the next one and you're going to have to wait for the cycle to come around again. And I think that's a reality that is not being discussed because it has to do with personal identity monikers. And so it's not nice to hear. But this is just the publishing industry treating you as a trend. And you'll sell again when the trend comes back around. That's what it is. Lucas and Sherrod aren't the only Black staffers to quit or be let go this time around. Dana Kennedy, who was hired in the 2020 at the publisher Simon & Schuster, left after 2 years. Lashara Brunting left from her position as an executive editor at Simon & Schuster also after 2 years. Anthony Key, the director of the multicultural marketing at Penguin Random House, moved to BET Media Group. Jennifer Baker was let go from her position as a senior editor at Amistad, about which she tweeted, "I'm mostly dismayed at how the authors I worked with have been disregarded." In February, the New York Times reported that the efforts to diversify the ranks of those working in publishing has moved much slower than many had hoped, quoting a report that showed that the share of publishing positions occupied by white employees had dropped only modestly from 76% in 2019 to 72.5% in 2023. One of the things that feels wrong about this is it's a celebration of people losing their jobs based on race. And I think that that is smarmy either way. I also think that this is not taking into consideration how many different companies have laid people off in the last couple of years because of the inflation, because of cost of living. I know so many game studios that laid off hundreds, if not thousands of people based, between the different studios. A bunch of newspapers have laid off so many journalists and so many people working for them. A bunch of tech companies have downsized, and so many people are going through downsizing because of the economy and because of outsourcing work to try to make it cheaper. And so I think there is more going on than it having anything to do with racial targeting. But then there are also businesses that are going to try to make back their money. And so if they don't think that this marketing is working anymore because that trend is out and they're going to move into another direction, then your side gets downsized. And that's just what it is. I think it's kind of manipulative to try to use your identity as a way to avoid getting fired or laid off when so many people are going through the same thing. But I'm not on the inside, so maybe there's likely discrimination going on too, because there's always discrimination going on. But I don't think it's any bigger than we're all struggling. But that's just me. Our data offers one big reason to hope that this time might be different: the volume. Previous cycles did not see nearly as large a burst in the sheer numbers of titles by writers of color as we have in the past few years. But publishing a wave of non-white writers is, in the grand scheme of things, relatively easy. Reforming the industry so that it can support those writers and make the wave more than a passing one is hard. Let me rephrase what that means. Getting people to buy these books is more difficult. We can force these books out. We can put them into a market that doesn't necessarily want what we are choosing to publish. But getting people to purchase them at the volume that we want people to purchase them is hard. And that's often why a lot of people lose their jobs, because they're not acquiring and selling the right kind of books to make the money that the company needs to keep publishing those books. That's at least my assumption. Again, if anybody's got better insight into how this works, let me know, but I don't think this is giving a full picture. Already initial sales figures have been disappointing. Everybody is losing sales, but what do you do when the fae fiction starts losing steam, when the zombie trend starts losing steam? You move on to something else. And trends don't stay. leading certain publishers to conclude that the market was saturated. Yeah, that's usually what happens when you oversaturate it with a current trend, according to the Times. Our research and interviews lead us to believe that the market is saturated only if one defines the market as white women from 35 to 60. Publishers have failed to invest in the infrastructure needed to discover and develop the latent readership for these books, and many argue that the industry itself still isn't supportive of people of color in its ranks. Okay, so notice a couple of things here. Our research and interviews lead us to believe. So that's not showing actual data or stats. That is saying they want to believe this. And I've read enough literature in freaking forensic psychology where they were like, so we went in with this assumption and we did this study and we got these results that were actually opposite of what our assumption was going in, but we are still going to double down on what our assumption was and say we need to do better. Like, I've seen enough of those that I need the hard information here, that their assumption that they're making is, well, people actually do want these. The people that want them are just not getting them, are just not hearing that they exist. I need to see that. The Whisper Network is still full of stories of people who haven't confronted their institutional biases, and those people can be very, very harmful for authors of color, Robert said. Diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts have their limits, the DEI lead at a major publishing house told Penn. I can do microaggression training until the end of the day, but that's not really going to change the actual representation. They contended that what will bring change is making serious concessions within the traditional budgets. So if it's not making money, sacrifice costs in other places, especially when it comes to marketing, publicity, and sales. Don't most authors not really get much for their publicity and marketing nowadays? Isn't that what I heard in general? Regina Brooks, the president of Serendipity Literary Agency, speaking at the underperformance of many of the first books acquired in 2020 and 2021, told the Times that there was nothing wrong with the books themselves. They were just books that the publishing industry didn't have the internal structure to sell. The industry needs to hire more non-white staffers in marketing, publicity, and sales. Oliver said that the lack of representation in these departments means that they cannot reach the readers that the books need to go to unless they're being directed by someone from that community. Is this assuming that people of different races don't talk to each other about the books that they read? Like, what does that mean? I also want to go back to this thing over here where it's talking about the whisper networks of institutional bias, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it's just me. So feel free to share your opinion, as always. But I don't think that you get long-lasting good results by trying to guilt or browbeat somebody into reading or enjoying something that they don't want to touch. So if you look at the way that content is being changed, that was initially for a more male audience, right? And then they take that content and they want to expand it to a female audience, but then they start changing things in that content in order to appease the female audience, and then it alienates the male audience because it's changing things that the male audience had liked. You're not going to get those male readers or viewers or fans back by shaming them as misogynists or sexists for not liking the elements that you think that some women will like. And let me tell you, some of the things that they insert because they think women will like it better are asinine assumptions, that are stereotyped assumptions. The only thing that you can do is respect the receiver of whatever it is that you're making and know who your audience is and give them the opportunity to see that content. But insulting people, calling them pansies, calling them sexist, calling them misogynists or misandrists, if we want to go the other way, because we've seen some of that too, calling people names and browbeating them into purchasing your thing does not make it better. It does not give you actual fans or interest in your content. Another way to look at it in a similar-ish, and I mean, maybe you'll just call me crazy and a false equivalency, and I guess that's fine too, but think of the authors that go onto social media and they kind of cry about either getting a bad review or they cry about not getting enough sales. And so then they get some pity sales, but nobody reads their book. People just wanted to support them so that they weren't sad anymore. And so they got that purchase. They didn't get actual fans. So for when the next book comes out, their sales are not going to change. Nobody is talking about their book. Nobody is excited for their book. Nobody is excited for them as an author. They did it as a favor. And so if you artificially make sales because of browbeating or disrespect or guilting, you're not only going to not create loyal interest and true interest in your work or your project, you're going to create resentment that actually creates the opposite effect and makes more people want to work against you. And so I think that is also being overlooked in this, where they think, well, we can change things by browbeating people into purchasing our special things. But I'm sorry, eventually a trend ends. And if you treat your identity as a trend, it's going to be treated as a trend. And at some point, the trend goes out. And I think that that's just a scary thing for a lot of people to say, so it doesn't get said. But also I think it's really, like, I understand cross-cultural, when we get into this, because I don't want to completely ignore cross-cultural understanding of like marketing and how you can talk to different people if you understand their culture better. But I think it's also asinine to pretend that people don't talk to people of different races or of different cultures. And so the only reason that these books aren't selling is because you don't have more racial discrimination in your marketing department in order to specifically market in a specific way. All too often, Oliver has found herself the one black editor with a team of white people around her. This can lead to situations like the one experienced by one of Robert's authors who went on book tour, and aside from the launch where she requested the bookseller, all of the audience and booksellers were white. So if that's just how things are, if I'm gonna go and work in another country, it feels kind of arrogant to think that you can demand the hiring practice of somebody who has basically commissioned you. Clearly, I have lost my mind. The book tour points to our deeper systemic problem. Because publishers have long assumed that white women are their primary market, investment in building our readership has been inhabited. They have seldom carried out the kinds of market research, for example, that would improve their ability to discover books for readers of different backgrounds. Industry assumptions and the lack of research are exuberated by infrastructural segregation, such that for books, for example, Circana Bookscan, the main source for sales figures, undercounts Black books consumers because many of them buy books from places that escape Bookscan's reach. Many people we spoke to, so then find a way to get those numbers. That's what you have to do, is prove those numbers, not be like, well, they're just imaginary numbers. Many of the publishers don't care if they don't see the money. Many people we spoke with for this article believe that there is a latent but untapped audience for books by writers of color. There are hundreds of African American book clubs in the United States. The Asian American Book Club, a national organization launched in February. The industry needs to invest in research and build relationships with bookstores, libraries, schools, and reading groups in Black communities. Creating a world in which writers of color thrive ought to be embraced as a long-term project. Many people on the ground are working towards such a world, but it won't happen unless executives follow suit. We have good reason to suspect that the publishing has reached a high watermark for Black representation, but this doesn't have to be the limit. We believe that performing data audits like ours is a powerful way to hold publishers to account, not only to readers and workers, but to themselves, and to keep them from repeating the cycles of the past and beyond, and seeing beyond the short-sighted demands of short-term financial growth toward the more flourishing literary culture for all. Okay, so important things here. Demands of short-term financial growth. So in general, you're still dealing with a business. They want to make their money back. But this is trying to say what's more important is changing culture than making money to a business. That's not really what most businesses are about. And if that's what your focus is, then these people are not trying to sell books. They're trying to control what you think, how you think, what you're allowed to be doing. And that makes us a lot more dubious, in my opinion. But let me know how you interpret that. The data audits here, again, I think are not legitimate because it doesn't include children's literature and YA, where there is a lot of diversity, especially because imagine that you've got 1,000 authors applying for something. If 2,000 of them apply to adults and the other 80 apply then to YA and children's literature, then you're going to look like you have a much smaller sample existing going to YA or going to adult when it's a very large sample. So this isn't really conclusive. But also it continually just says the Black communities, and it totally takes out the other communities that it also sectioned out. So where are those readers? It's going to bring up the Asian American book club, but then never actually talk about Asian books. It is constantly just going back to the same singular community and the same singular expressions. So that kind of makes me wonder, what is the narration of this article doing? It doesn't take into account anything that is being sold or the interest in foreign books and translations and manga, the increased interest into foreign books and like things like manga. I feel like it's such a trap to say it. I can't stand the thing of we need to hold people accountable for not doing what we want them to do. There is such a big bully culture right now in general where people think that they can make others do what they want to do by being rude, by being bullies, by being entitled. You go, oh, we've changed. Freaking changing Sonic the Hedgehog for that movie was a mistake, because you see a bunch of people on Twitter now and in social media in general thinking that they can bully publishers and creators and game creators into doing things the way that they want them to do, that they have some entitlement over your creative process. I've had people even go to me, hey, aren't I your customer? So do what I want you to do. You can be here to see what I do, and I appreciate it if you do see what I do, because you choose to spend your time with something that I've made. It doesn't mean that I owe you anything. I don't make that promise. The only thing that I promise to people is I try not to waste their time. And I'm sure that I don't fail. I'm sure that I will get plenty of people that are like, you freaking wasted my time today. That's fine. But I have had people email me that have said, hey, I read your book. Now you owe it to read mine. I let you know that it was there. I didn't tell you to read it. I didn't make you read it. And so engaging in that way is a manipulative practice. I've seen, oh my gosh, what I saw a couple weeks ago was somebody complaining about Kirkus reviews and saying that they were so pissed off that they couldn't see the names of the reviewers of the reviews because they couldn't hold reviewers to account for what they say, just in case they decided that it was done in bad faith. So at this point, we've now got authors that are saying they need to hold reviewers accountable for what the reviewers say about their experience with a book. People think that they can control other people, and I hate it. You can make suggestions. You can hope for the best for other people, but there is such a desire to control and dominate and bully and guilt and strong arm people into the wall of making them behave the way that you want them to behave. And there's name calling and there's gentle suggestions over and over and over again to make sure that you are going in the right way, little lammy, until they start calling you names. It's not good. But this specific line, I want your guys' thoughts on, where they're talking about, no, ignore funds, ignore that this is a business. We want the culture to go in a certain way. So let the business fail. Let me tell you, now I'm not a business expert. In fact, I suck the most probably with money. But if you don't have money to run the business, then you can't keep doing the thing that spreads your message. It all fails. It all falls down. It all becomes a corpse of what it used to be because it can't sustain itself on changing the culture when changing the culture doesn't pay. So that's the video. I'm sorry if it was offensive, but I do think that you have to ask offensive questions. You have to say offensive things in order to discuss the reality of life. And is there discrimination? Yes. Has there always been discrimination? Yes. Has discrimination shifted from one way or another? Yes. We've had people discussing in general that white people have been discriminated against in publishing, and that includes some of the people I've covered on this channel, and James Patterson said the same thing among them, and then walked it back when he got in trouble for it. This shows that there was active discrimination. Now, whether I'm saying discrimination without positive or negative connotations, it's just a discernment. In the same way that I discriminate against women in dating because I am interested in men. That's discrimination. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There are a few of you I love anyway, but there has been discrimination. There's been discrimination in the past. There's been current discrimination. There's been discussion of future discrimination. There's been an obvious expression of a desire to discriminate in the future. So it's there. But we also have to talk about these things. And based on what this article even says about the cycles of interest and the way that this popped up and then went back down pretty much the same way every trend goes, that's what it feels like to me. And I know it doesn't feel great to hear that your identity is a trend or that your medical history is a trend, but that's just business. And I think it's a sick business. I don't think that American companies should do it. But at the end of the day, the people that use that as a cudgel to get ahead are eventually going to not be able to do that and are going to have to find something else to sell because your trend will fall out. And the people that came to you for that trend are going to look for something else to do. I just have to add an amendum here at the end because, yes, I do agree with something on this article. It's not necessarily the marketing department that I think needs replacement, though who the frick knows? Not necessarily the authors yet either. Let's start with the agents, the gatekeepers to everyone. Over 80% of American literary agents are white, and minimally 82% of them are female. Start there to get diversity in the taste of books that are optioned and passions pursued, because a lot of these share a lot of the same exact things, which include steamy YA romantasy, which are two things that should never go together. Children's literature and steamy sex. So how about we diversify what people are looking for instead of having a bunch of women who are all fairly the same treating the publishing industry like a personal book club? Then we can start seeing if it changes the literary landscape. Because right now, I don't think that the current traditional publishing apparatus is serving anybody but those women. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Atlantic's article, Has the DEI Backlash Come for Publishing? Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. What a disaster. I'm scared. With that said, have a great weekend and don't die.
The only people who should come are those who want to meet their monsters.
If this is what Agatha wants, I don't know how we can even dispute it.
I change lives, baby.
And I end them. Sweetheart, no bargains hold. Only fools know restraint.
Only losers lose!
I've been under the knife so many times, I'm practically immune to it.
If your scissors are dull, may I recommend sharpening them with leather?
I think I hit you.
Mimal says I must have a guardian angel.
To enter the ring but abstain from playing is suicidal. Your virtue makes you nothing but a liability.
You're gonna die. You're gonna die. You're gonna die.